Can you guess the decade of these classic cars? Let's see. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. This car hails from the 1930s. It's the 1928 Citroën C6. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. This car comes from the 1940s. 1937 Alfa Romeo 8C 2900B Lungo Berlinetta. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. This car was created in the 1950s. The fabulous 1948 Ferrari 166 Sport. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. Created in the 1960s, this was the magnificent 1957 Jaguar XKSS. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Built in the 1980s, the 1973 Ferrari 365 GTB 4 Daytona. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. The correct decade was the 1990s. The 1980 Lotus Esprit Turbo. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. Made in the 1940s, the 1936 Bugatti Type 57 SE Atlantic. A. 1950s. B. 1960s. C. 1970s. D. 1980s. Originating in the 1950s, the enchanting 1948 Aston Martin DB1 2-liter Sports. A. 1950s. B. 1960s. C. 1970s. D. 1980s. One of the most beautiful cars from the 1970s, the 1966 Porsche 911. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. From the 1990s, 1981 DeLorean DMC-12. You're doing great. Keep your focus up because the questions are getting even harder now. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. Made in the 1960s, the 1952 Alfa Romeo Disco Volante Spider. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. From the 1960s, the 1956 Ferrari 250 GT Coupe Prototipo. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. The jewel of the 1950s, the 1946 Italia 202. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. The favorite car of every 90s kid, 1984 Ferrari Testarossa. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Probably the hottest car in the 1980s. The 1978 Lamborghini Countach LP400 Periscopo. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. This car defined the 1960s. The 1955 Porsche 356A 1500 GS Carrera Speedster. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Made in the 1970s, this was the 1965 Ford GT40 Mark I. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. From the Fast and Furious 1980s, the 1978 Maserati Bora. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. From the Wild 50s, the 1946 Maserati A6 1500. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. Created in the 1970s, the marvelous 1964 Jaguar E-Type 3.8 Roadster. What's your favorite classic car? Let us know in the comments. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. Built in the 1960s, as beautiful as ever, the 1954 Chevrolet Corvette. A. 1940s. B. 1950s. C. 1960s. D. 1970s. One of the most famous cars in the 1970s, the 1965 Aston Martin DB5. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. In the 1990s, Aston Martin upgraded their game even more with the 1989 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. In the 1960s, Citroën came up with the 1952 Citroën 2CV. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. The decade was the 1980s. The car, of course, the 1979 Ferrari 308 GTB. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. This was easy. Made in the 1970s, the 1968 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray L88 Coupe. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Created in the 1990s, the 1982 Maserati Khamsin. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. 1960s Jaguars were something special indeed. The 1952 Jaguar XK120 Supersonic. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Once again, dream car of every 90s kid. The 1985 Lamborghini Countach LP5000S. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Created in the 1970s, this was the 1968 Lamborghini Miura. What's your favorite classic car era decade? Why? Let us know in the comments. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Coming to us from the 1990s, the 1986 Aston Martin V8 Vantage Zagato Coupe. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. The 1940s was a special decade in the auto industry. 1934 Chrysler Airflow is probably the greatest result of it. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. The wild 1980s brought us the 1973 Porsche 911 Turbo prototype. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. Luxury meets comfort in the 1970s. The 1963 Lincoln Continental Convertible. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. The 1990s brought us the 1986 Lamborghini LM002 as well. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. This was probably easy. Built in the 1970s, the 1966 Ford Shelby Mustang. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. From the roaring 1960s, the 1957 MG MGA Cabriolet. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. This car defined the 1930s, the 1929 Buick Super 8 Special. A. 1920s. B. 1930s. C. 1940s. D. 1950s. Class meets luxury. Built in the 1950s, the 1948 Chrysler New Yorker. A. 1960s. B. 1970s. C. 1980s. D. 1990s. This was supposed to be easy too. From the 1970s, the 1966 Pontiac GTO. Thanks for watching. How many points did you end up with? Subscribe, give us a like, and let us know in the comments.